What's going on, guys? Today we are getting into exercise in the cold. So you already talked about the heat. In the next learning outcome, we're going to finish up with exercise at altitude or with hypoxia. So today we're going to be talking about our exposure to cold. Now, for all of you at Gilbert, doesn't really become too applicable to you, especially not in the summertime, but for everyone here, especially in the wintertime, it's going to be greatly beneficial for you. So ultimately, this is going to answer our learning outcome 6. So we're going to look at how we are affected by the cold, what our adaptations are to that, and then what the possible health ramifications are with that. So let's go ahead and break this down from a fundamental standpoint. When we're talking about exercise in the cold, or we're talking about any sort of cold exposure, you're just simply talking about being in an environment that is going to deplete or decrease your core body temperature. So in that regard, exercise in the cold or physical activity in the cold is kind of relative to each individual person. If you're someone who is well acclimated to the cold, you're going to have a diminished response to the exposure to the cold. If you're someone who doesn't have a lot of exposure to the cold, you'll see a greater response to it. So we'll explore that in a little bit more detail here in a bit. The main points that we'll see here are that when you're exposed to the cold, you are going to have a greater energy expenditure. You're going to increase overall fluid loss. So think about when you're outside in the cold and you can see your breath, you're actually going to be losing a lot more moisture through your breath because of how hot and humid inside of your mouth and throat is versus how cold and dry it is out in the environment. So you're going to be losing actually a lot more moisture and fluids just from breathing in the cold environment than you would in any other environment. And then your respiratory system will also be irritated. So we'll take a look at that as well. Now, I want to first start off with the immediate responses we have to being exposed to the cold. So the first thing you have here is this cold shock response. This is specific to jumping in or being exposed to cold water. If you ever jump into very cold water, you are going to have a cold shock response. What that typically involves is that you're going to have an involuntary inhalation. So the minute you hit that cold water and your body recognizes how different the temperature is, you're going to involuntarily breathe in very quick. This can cause aspiration of water into the lungs. So I have up here that the majority of people who die playing sports die because of cold. Now, when we look at triathletes, over the last roughly 10 years, about 80% of all triathletes who died during an event did so in the swim portion of the event. Typically, you're swimming in open waters that are usually cold. And even if you're in the cold, even if you're in a hot environment, like let's say you're in Southern California in the summer, the water temperature is still going to be very cold. Other things that can happen as a result of this are vasoconstriction. So your blood vessels tighten up. They get smaller. The diameter decreases. This can end up causing an MI or a myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. You can also have an increase in your respiratory rate, so you can start hyperventilating and breathing a lot more, and that can also increase your heart rate, and again that can cause you to potentially breathe in water setting drowning in. Now, one thing about this, and we'll get into this as well in the next slide, is this whole concept of hypothermia. If we just break down hypothermia, and I'm sure most all of you are pretty familiar with it, but hypo means low, thermia means temperature, so hypothermia just means low body temperature. Specifically, when we're exposed to hypothermia, or I shouldn't say exposed to it, when our body experiences hypothermia, we have a core body temperature of under 95 degrees. Now, even if you have no adaptations to the cold, hypothermia, even in water, is going to take a lot longer than what you would think. Now, this means for all you Titanic fans that this was absolute terrible. Now, everyone knows that Rose had enough room to let Jack on that doorstep there, but Jack would have survived for roughly 30 minutes or more, even in those freezing waters. Now, granted, after about 15 minutes or so, he's going to lose pretty much all ability to do any functional movement, but if Rose just never let go, Jack would have probably lived. Now, one of the big things that's going to happen pretty quickly with hypothermia is you have a very big shift in cognitive ability. So your cognition is going to decline rapidly. After about 15 to 30 minutes of exposure to cold water, meaning sub 40 degree water, you're pretty much not going to be able to have any meaningful cognition. Things as simple as even talking and making a coherent sentence are going to be virtually impossible for you. So most of the time though, if you are in cold water, you survive if you don't drown. That's the big problem there, is that you wouldn't be able to hold yourself afloat for long enough. Now, one of the things that we're going to be looking at here is this idea of having repeated exposure to the cold. If you get repeated exposure to the cold, that's what's called habituation. What will happen here is that the more times you're exposed to the cold, the less it's going to have an effect on you. So the big question that comes here is, should you be practicing in the cold for all of you athletes? And how much should you be practicing? We'll be answering that question here in the next couple slides, but let's take a look first at how our body adapts to the cold. So I mentioned a minute ago that we have this concept called habituation. Habituation just means that with continued exposure, repeated exposure to a stimulus, your body adapts to it. So your body gets used to it. Now, an environmental acclimatization or an acclimation versus an environmental adaptation. Adaptations in the environment take generations. You're not going to have an environmental adaptation in your lifetime, let alone in, say, like a single season or a week of practice. But you can acclimatize yourself to the environment pretty quickly. Now, when you are exposing yourself to the cold, a one-time exposure does nothing for you. If you had a coach that wants you to practice in the cold one day to get ready for a game, you might as well just go get a good night's rest, because you're not going to be acclimated at all to the cold. This is going to be similar to what you would see with acclimation to the heat or acclimation to altitude. You need time to let your body acclimate. While the research varies on this, roughly 1 week of exposure to the cold is kind of what you need to really get a good acclimatization to it. Now, if you are repeatedly exposed to the cold, you're going to get your core body temperature to decrease. And it's going to decrease to really as your set piece here. What'll happen is that if you are staying still in the cold. Your core temperature is actually going to decline or get colder quicker than if you weren't exposed to the cold. However, if you are repeatedly exposed to the cold and you're moving, so you're exercising, you're doing physical activity, your core body temperature stays elevated longer. Now, the way this is offset is through your resting VO2. So your resting VO2 is going to decrease. That means that you're going to have a diminished performance ability or a diminished aerobic capacity when you're at the cold. So if you are repeatedly exposed to the cold and you're just sitting still in the cold, you are going to get into hypothermia much quicker than anyone else. If you are repeatedly exposed to the cold but you exercise, your body temperature will maintain elevated much longer. Now, the other thing that happens here is we have shivering. So whenever you shiver, what's happening is your body forms goose pimples and you shake, and that's all in an attempt to heat up your body. So what will happen is your body will shiver, causing muscle contractions from even your skin nerve cells. So your hair follicles in your skin are all surrounded by small muscles. Those all shake and shiver, along with your skeletal muscle, and even to a smaller extent your adipose tissue, so your fat, causing an increase in your body temperature. When this happens, you can actually increase your resting metabolic rate, so your basal metabolism or your resting metabolism, by 400 to 500%. So if you want to lose weight, and specifically you want to lose fat, you should go be in the cold, because that is going to just absolutely drive your metabolism into overdrive. The downside to that is that you can't be exposing yourself or staying in the cold long, because the negative health effects of it are going to counteract any positives you would get out of, say, like weight loss or any sort of exercise adaptations. Now, the longer you're exposed to the cold, the more you're going to adapt to this in terms of shivering. So shivering after being exposed to the cold takes longer to occur. So if we looked at time for shivering versus cold days, this would look like that. The longer or the more days you are exposed to cold, the longer the time it takes for you to start shivering. This means that your core body temperature has to get lower than normal for you to even feel cold. This means that you can have a positive adaptation to this by maintaining overall body function, with kind of one real kind of big exception, but your overall body function can actually maintain at normal levels even when you have prolonged exposure to the cold. The one exception to this is that your dexterity is going to be diminished no matter what. So no matter what you do, your ability to have your fine motor skills with your hands is not going to work out well. Now, finishing off here with how we can adapt to exercise. I posed the question earlier of should you be practicing in the cold? If you are going to be playing in the cold, you need to be practicing in it for roughly a week beforehand. The big problems with cold exposure are that you aren't going to be able to have an increase in VO2 max. Your VO2 max is going to diminish. The whole reason why this happens is because you're switching to anaerobic metabolism even in aerobic environments. This means that even if I was, say, running a marathon or trying to run a marathon in the cold, my body would switch to anaerobic or non-oxidative metabolism because that is going to be faster and it's going to produce more heat than aerobic metabolism would, because oxygen is needed to help me to shiver. This means you're going to fatigue a lot quicker. You're going to experience fatigue when you're trying to do high intensity endurance or aerobic activity in less than 10 minutes. Now, if you are going to be trying to do any dynamic exercise, so you're trying to do, like, say, agility work, you're trying to do plyometrics, this is going to be just absolutely impaired from even prolonged exposure to the cold. This all sounds really bad, but what are some benefits here? Well, some benefits we have highlighted here. Your muscle fiber types will actually start shifting. Because you're going to rely a lot more on anaerobic metabolism, you actually will get a transformation of type 1 fibers or slow twitch fibers into type 2A fibers or intermediate fast twitch hybrids. So that can potentially be really beneficial for you when you go back to a normal environment, now having more type 2 fibers. You're going to get an increase in capillary density. This means that your muscle fibers are going to actually have a lot more capillaries and therefore an increase in blood flow after you've been exposed to the cold for a long time. And then what's really important here is this idea of cross-adaptation. What this means is that if you were to adapt to an environment of the cold, you can actually get your body to adapt easier to going to altitude or to being exposed to the heat. So being exposed to any one of the three major weather conditions, altitude, cold, or hot, can actually have a cross adaptation to it, meaning that you can actually get positive adaptations to all three just by training for one. Now, I wouldn't go out of my way and say that, if I am, up training at altitude, that all of a sudden I can be exposed to 120 degree heat here in Phoenix and be okay. But my body's response to that extreme shift in the environment is going to be much better prepared than if I haven't been adapting to any of those environments. One last thing about your health, I mentioned about how this is going to irritate your respiratory system. Whenever you're in the cold and you think about, say, seeing your breath, you usually get, those feelings of like your insides are drying out. Well, when you have this big gradient change in humidity and also temperature, it is going to, the environment's going to just suck out moisture from your body much quicker. So if you are someone that has asthma, you should really avoid exercising in the cold, because this can trigger an exercise-induced bronchospasm or a full-on asthma attack if you are exposed to the cold for too long, like you're trying to do exercise in the cold and you're not doing a good job with keeping your insides well moistened. The way you get around this is by wearing some sort of mask or face guard. This would be like if you wrapped like a scarf around your face. That is going to help keep moisture in. A lot of these fabric-based face guards, face masks, things like that, do really, really well with keeping moisture encapsulated or enclosed in your body and not allowing it out into the environment. So doing that can be really beneficial for you there. So, to kind of sum this all up, you should try to expose yourself to the cold for at least a week before any sort of event or competition, game, whatnot, to get the best chances of adapting to that environment. Prolonged exposure to the cold is somewhat beneficial, but it still doesn't give you that much of an athletic benefit from doing it. The possible benefits for adaptation there are much more on, like, say, the health side of it. So adapting to the cold could help us with our overall health, but it's really not going to help us insofar as becoming much more athletically able. So that is everything there for exercise in the cold. So I hope you guys have all learned a thing or two. And then next time you're going to be finishing up here with hypoxia and altitude training. And then we will be getting into unit number last. So until then, I will see you guys later.